Hi, for this video I wanted to talk about a question that has been on my mind for quite a while, and that is, where are the gay girls? The media coverage of the suicides that happened in September caught the nation's attention about the dangers of homophobia and especially bullying in middle school, high school, and college, to the point where the names of at least 6 young gay or perceived to be gay boys were spread across the news, and people started to talk about the importance of raising awareness about homophobic bullying and the dangers that it causes our young kids. The It Gets Better project was started for people to talk about how we can address and reach out to young kids across the country and let them know that it gets better, that they're not alone, that suicide doesn't need to be the only option that they see before them. So when Tyler Clementi, Asher Brown, Seth Walsh, Raymond Chase became names that people were readily thinking of and talking about, there was a real lack of attention to lesbian experiences or the experiences of queer girls, and that is what I want to talk about. Because one would think that there were no lesbians or queer girls in September struggling or committing suicide because the media didn't pay attention to it. In the moment when suddenly so much attention is being drawn to this issue, you would think that there would be a hypersensitivity and the urge to cover these sorts of stories. And when people like Dan Savage were asked, where are the gay girls in this sort of sadness and tragedy that's striking everybody in September, his response was that homophobia targets young, effeminate, slight boys in a different way than it does girls, that there's a greater acceptance for tomboys, and girls aren't bullied in the same way that the vicious attacks are directed towards young, effeminate boys. I heard this, and that really was problematic to me for a number of reasons. One, Dan Savage's response is conflating gender presentation with sexual identity, making it sound as if the only gay boys who are harassed are the slight, small, effeminate boys, when we know that there are lots of gay people who look and behave in lots of different ways. And furthermore, that he is playing into a sort of stereotype that lesbians are all masculinely gendered or are tomboys, and we know well enough too that not all tomboys are lesbians and not all lesbians are tomboys. So Dan Savage's response to the question problematically conflated too many things and yet dismissed the real experiences of queer girls being bullied, being lesbians, and also played into a sort of assumption about that, I don't know, it seems like when we talk about LGBT, we often are talking mostly about the gays, the gay men, and not so much lesbians, hardly ever the bisexuals, and rarely transgendered people. So part of the reason why I want to talk about this is because, in fact, there were lesbians committing suicide. Unfortunately, on October 4th, the news came out, not readily heard by many people, but there were 2 lesbians in Canada who committed suicide together, Chantal Dube, who was 17, and Janine Blanchette, who was 21. And then in California, there was the 19-year-old Aisha Hassan who committed suicide. She was a Howard University student and a lesbian. So these 3 lesbians committed suicide October 4th, the same day that Dan Savage is questioned on the radio, and just days, September 29th, was when Raymond Chase and Seth Walsh actually died too. So days after those stories are covered, there's no attention, no media coverage of these lesbian suicides. So question, why? Where are the gay girls? It's not that they're not committing suicide, it's that we aren't paying attention to it for some reason. So I wanted to talk about that. Upon doing a little bit more research, I was tipped off to the story of Chantal and Janine by AfterEllen.com. There was a story there of saying that the It Gets Better project was seeming to not be directed towards lesbian audiences because most of the people contributing the videos were straight celebrities or gay men. And then they had a story about Chantal and Janine that there were these two lesbians who did commit suicide too. But the strange thing is that in their case, bullying didn't seem to be central. And neither was bullying really central in what people said about Aisha's experience. For Janine and Chantal, Janine's family and friends pretty much chalked it up to her being mentally not well, that she was in a lot of pain and she was hurting, but that her sexuality, they said, didn't seem to really contribute to her committing suicide. And then in Aisha's case, her friend said that she was just struggling with a lot of things. Perhaps sexual expression, or the expression of her sexual identity, was one of the things that she was struggling with, but more importantly, it was just a lot of things. And so, for me, it's curious that friends and family members of Chantal, Janine, and Aisha were decentralizing their sexuality, of making their sexual identities less of an issue and instead putting so much emphasis on the fact that they were struggling or in pain or just hurting, without really questioning perhaps the possibility that this lack of a recognition or an appreciation for a young girl's sexuality, especially queer sexuality, could be in part a contributing factor to one's experience of struggle or pain or hurt. That if one's sexual identity is not being acknowledged in full as something that people contend with, then maybe that too contributes to the struggles that people have. So that was just one little idea that I had, and that is related to an old essay that was written by Adrienne Rich called Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, where there she talks about this compulsory heterosexuality, a forced institutionalized heterosexual identity for girls and women, where any sort of lesbian existence is covered over, erased, ignored, dismissed, or just chalked up to be like an anomaly. I mean, it's the same sort of thing that you hear where like all lesbianism is just a phase, or it's something that women turn to if they hate men. It's not a natural phenomenon, just kind of like this weird aberration from the norm, but it's not taken seriously. And so then you get the sense that there are no lesbians, that everybody is a heterosexual woman, and to a certain degree there's this forced compulsory character of the heterosexuality that makes it so that there seem to be less lesbians. I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a second, but the reaction from the friends and family members of Aisha, Chantal, and Janine really spoke to me about this like covering over of a lesbian existence, and the same thing too with Dan Savage's comments, which I find to be problematic. So in response to that, I wanted to read a section from this book, Sexual Fluidity by Lisa Diamond. And she has done a longitudinal study on female sexuality with the hope of clarifying the differences between male sexuality and female sexuality. Much of the research that's been done on homosexuality has dealt with male subjects, and thus there's been an assumption that male and female experiences of sexual identity, sexual orientation are the same. They run parallel, but there's a sort of, you are gay or straight, and then that's how it is for the rest of your life. And that is a model that seems more appropriate to a lot of men, but not for women. So instead, Lisa Diamond is suggesting that we rethink our notions of sexuality to include a greater degree of fluidity for female experiences. So not trying to essentialize what female sexuality is, and not to suggest that there aren't lesbians who are lesbians from very, very young ages, but I think that there's a more sophisticated story here that has to be fully appreciated in order for us to actually have effective outreach programs like the It Gets Better Project to speak to the experiences of young girls, young women, that doesn't dismiss their identities, doesn't dismiss their experiences, and doesn't negate what they might be going through by, I don't know, somehow making their sexual identities or sexual experiences less central to who they are than we do for like young gay men. So I'm going to read a section from one of the subjects from Diamond Studies, Minnie Pratt, and she says, "I didn't feel different, but was I? From whom? Had I changed, and from what? Was I heterosexual in adolescence only to become lesbian in my late 20s? Was I a lesbian always but coerced into heterosexuality, which echoes more of what Rich is talking about? Was I a less authentic lesbian than my friends who had always known that they were sexually and affectionately attracted to other women? And what kind of woman was a lesbian woman? Diamond goes on to say that the rigid prototype of sexuality is authentic, not the experiences of people like Pratt's. Greater appreciation and awareness of sexual fluidity are critical not only for building more accurate models of sexuality, but also for communicating to women, young and old, lesbian and heterosexual, married and single, that flexible, changing patterns of sexual response are normal rather than deviant, and that they can occur in any woman at any stage of life. She also goes on to say that if programs like outreach programs cling to rigid models of sexual orientation that inadequately represent the enormous variability in female sexuality, women may end up feeling doubly deviant, their experiences reflecting neither mainstream societal expectations nor perceived norms of typical gay experience. We must refashion science and public outreach to better represent women's experiences. Towards the end of the book, in the conclusion, Diamond says that the fluidity of female sexuality has not been entirely unnamed or hidden from view. It remains beneath the radar, so to speak, hidden in plain sight. But which is worse? For one's experiences to be silenced and made invisible, or for those experiences to be voiced and visible yet dismissed by scientists, politicians, family members, friends, perhaps even lovers, as inauthentic, unusual, exceptional, and trivial. She says, our slavish adherence to a rigid and obviously ill-fitting model of sexuality makes a certain amount of sense on personal, scientific, and psychological levels. The conventional categorical model is easy to understand. It generates nice, clean predictions. It is politically expedient. It provides psychological comfort. In the final analysis, however, none of these factors are acceptable substitutes for truth. Women's experiences range and throw our current sexual theories to be insufficient. They leave our experiences unexplained. Experiences like inexplicably falling in love and never forgetting one person, a summer when everything changed, dreams and fantasies that don't fit, memories of a different self long ago, expectations of a different self in the future. And Diamond says we cannot allow such experiences to collapse and disappear for want of clear, creative language. Our task is to create this language and to start listening. So I know that was fast, but I wanted to put out some other information that maybe can help account for why there seems to be a real lack of attention for queer girls and their experiences. And for any sort of outreach, we need to think differently about how we are hearing about stories of queer youth. The gay girls are out there, the media didn't cover it, and I think there's more in operation here than just the fact that they overlooked it. So I hope that gives you some food for thought, and thanks for watching.